In a world that teaches women to reveal more to be seen, Islam teaches women to cover to be valued. The hijab is not a symbol of oppression, it is a declaration of dignity. It is not a cage, it is a crown. The world may tell you that freedom means taking it off. True freedom is in knowing who you are without needing validation from anyone but your creator. In today's world, where a woman's worth is often measured by how she looks rather than who she is, the hijab stands as a silent rebellion, a statement that says, I am more than my body. The irony of our age is that while the world preaches empowerment, it often does so by stripping women of modesty, convincing them that exposure is liberation. But in reality, this so-called freedom has only made women more objectified, more scrutinized, and more pressured to meet impossible standards of beauty. The hijab challenges that narrative. It teaches a woman to define herself not through the eyes of society, but through the eyes of her creator. It reminds her that she doesn't need to dress for validation, attention, or acceptance, because she already has worth granted by Allah himself. The hijab says, I belong to the one who made me, not to the gaze of the world. That is not oppression. That is empowerment of the highest order. The command to wear the hijab is not about restriction, it is about recognition. Recognition that a woman's body is sacred, her presence dignified, and her soul precious. When a Muslim woman covers herself, she is not hiding, she is protecting something valuable. We cover what we value, our jewelry, our treasures, our secrets, and the hijab is no different. It is a shield, not a shackle. It frees a woman from the exhausting cycle of seeking external validation and allows her to live with quiet confidence, knowing her worth is not up for debate. The world calls it oppression because it cannot understand a woman who chooses to live by divine guidance instead of societal pressure. But that's exactly what makes the hijab powerful. It's a conscious choice of obedience in a world of rebellion, a declaration of faith in a time of doubt, a mark of strength when conformity is easier. The hijab also nurtures a woman's inner world. It shifts her focus from being seen to being known by Allah. It builds humility, sincerity, and spiritual clarity. Every time she steps out wearing her hijab, she's making a statement not just to society, but to herself. I walk this path for Allah. That awareness shapes her character. It softens her heart and strengthens her soul. She becomes more mindful of her actions, her words, and her purpose. The hijab reminds her that she represents something greater than herself. She represents Islam, and with that realization comes honor. The hijab becomes not just an external covering, but an internal transformation, a reminder to embody patience, mercy, and dignity in a world that thrives on arrogance, noise, and vanity. So when the world points at her and says, "You are oppressed," she smiles because she knows that true oppression is to live enslaved to society's expectations. True oppression is to feel unworthy without makeup, incomplete without attention, seen without validation. But the woman who wears hijab has already broken those chains. She stands tall, covered in grace, walking with purpose, protected by divine love. Her strength doesn't come from defiance. It comes from submission to Allah. And that submission is not weakness, it's freedom. Because in surrendering to Allah, she is no longer bound by the standards of anyone else. The hijab is not a symbol of limitation, but a reflection of liberation. Liberation from the need to please the creation, because she is content with pleasing the Creator. In a world where the word freedom has been twisted to mean exposure, the hijab stands as a divine paradox, a covering that reveals strength, a fabric that hides but elevates, a command that restricts yet liberates. Many fail to understand that the hijab is not about limiting a woman's identity, but about protecting her purity and preserving her inner worth. The West often portrays it as a symbol of oppression, a tool of male control, or a cultural relic. Yet that perspective comes from a lens clouded by materialism and misunderstanding. True oppression is not in modesty. It is in the endless pursuit of acceptance through appearance. It is in being told that your value lies in how much skin you show, how much you conform to beauty standards, how much you fit into a shallow definition of empowerment. The woman who wears hijab refuses that narrative. She says to the world, "You do not define me. My Creator does." That is not weakness. That is power. When she chooses to cover, she is reclaiming ownership over her body, her mind, and her soul. She is declaring that her identity is not open for public consumption, but reserved for the one who fashioned her in perfection. The hijab, then, is not about hiding beauty. It is about redefining it. It is a reminder that beauty is not for display, but for dignity. It is not for the gaze of strangers, but for the contentment of the soul. What the world fails to grasp is that the hijab is a form of worship, an act of love, not fear. When a woman places that piece of cloth on her head, she is saying, "Why, Allah, I submit to your wisdom," even when the world questions it. She is choosing eternal validation over temporary applause. She is choosing to be seen by Allah rather than admired by people. And that is the essence of spiritual empowerment. Because in a society that thrives on the exploitation of women's bodies, the woman who covers herself for Allah becomes a walking act of defiance. Every time she steps outside her home, she challenges the system that profits from her insecurity. She becomes a symbol of faith in a culture of fashion, a voice of modesty in a world obsessed with exposure. Yet her strength is quiet. It doesn't need slogans or protests to prove its worth. Her hijab speaks for her silently, powerfully, and beautifully. It whispers that she knows who she is, and she doesn't need anyone's permission to exist with dignity. The fabric that covers her head becomes a reminder to the world that her value lies not in her form, but in her faith. The hijab also transforms the inner world of the believer. It becomes a constant reminder of accountability, a reflection of the relationship between her and Allah. When she wears it, she becomes conscious of her actions, her words, and her presence. She carries herself with humility, not because she is forced to, because she understands that modesty is a reflection of the heart before it is an expression of the body. The hijab is not just cloth, it is character. It teaches her discipline in a world that encourages indulgence, self-respect in a culture that glorifies self-display, and faith in an era that worships self-obsession. It becomes her armor, not to hide from the world, but to walk through it untouched by its illusions. The woman who wears hijab learns to see herself as Allah sees her, valuable, honored, and sacred. That self-awareness gives her peace in a way that no worldly validation ever could. She no longer needs to chase compliments or approval because she already has the love of her Lord. She begins to understand that the hijab is not about others looking at her differently. It's about her seeing herself differently, through the lens of faith, not fashion. And in that understanding, she finds liberation, because when a woman ties her identity to the ever-changing standards of society, she becomes enslaved to them. But when she ties her identity to Allah, she becomes unshakable. The hijab frees her from being a product of trends and turns her into a servant of truth. It reminds her that the most beautiful thing about her is not what can be seen, but what cannot: her heart, her taqwa, her faith. The hijab teaches her that her worth was never meant to be seen by the world. It was meant to be cherished by Allah. It teaches her that modesty is not silence, it's power wrapped in grace. The strength of a woman in hijab is not in her defiance of the world, but in her submission to her Lord. And when she chooses Allah over the world, she gains both dignity and peace. The hijab, therefore, is not oppression, it is protection. It is not backwardness, it is boldness. It is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is a reminder to every woman that she is enough, even when the world tells her she is not, because her worth was written by the one who created her, and that worth is beyond measure. In a world where appearance is glorified and self-worth is measured through the lens of social validation, the hijab stands as a revolutionary act of faith, a quiet rebellion against superficiality, and a profound statement of inner strength. The woman who chooses to wear it is not surrendering to oppression, but rising above a system that objectifies her. She understands that the hijab is not just a piece of cloth, but a spiritual declaration, a promise between her and her creator. It is a reflection of conviction, coercion. It is the embodiment of dignity, not submission. Society tells women that freedom means revealing more, displaying more, and becoming more visible to the world. But the hijab redefines that narrative entirely. It teaches that true freedom is not in exposing yourself to meet worldly standards, in freeing yourself from those standards altogether. The woman who wears hijab chooses to be known for her mind, her faith, and her character rather than her body. She refuses to be reduced to an image or a desire. Instead, she becomes a representation of discipline and devotion. Each time she steps into a world that questions her choice, she carries within her the courage of conviction, the strength to say, "I am not defined by your gaze." That is empowerment in its purest form. The hijab also cultivates a deeper sense of self-awareness and connection with Allah that goes beyond the physical covering. It becomes a daily reminder of faith and purpose, shaping not only how a woman dresses, but how she behaves speaks, and interacts with the world. It molds her identity around modesty and sincerity, qualities that elevate her soul rather than her image. Through this divine command, she learns to prioritize inner beauty over outer validation, sincerity over attention, and obedience over trends. She begins to realize that every act of modesty is an act of worship. Every moment of resistance to societal pressure is a victory of faith. The hijab, therefore, becomes her armor not against people, but against the illusions of a world that measures worth through appearance. It reminds her that her value is not something that can be displayed or taken away. It is something sacred and protected by Allah. When she wears the hijab, she walks with peace because she knows she has chosen her creator over creation. She does not seek to please eyes that will one day close, but seeks the pleasure of the one whose gaze never fades. In that awareness lies true liberation. The hijab is not oppression. It is clarity, strength, and serenity woven together. It is a visible act of devotion that guards invisible treasures, faith, dignity, and self-respect. It tells the world that her beauty is not for display, but for her Lord, and through that truth, she stands unshaken, a symbol of courage, conviction, and divine strength. The hijab, in its essence, is not simply an external expression, but a spiritual journey that begins deep within the heart. It represents the struggle of the soul to align itself with divine purpose in a world that constantly pulls it toward worldly validation. When a woman chooses to wear the hijab, she is making a conscious decision to detach herself from the illusions of beauty standards that society imposes upon her. Every time she ties her scarf, she reaffirms her submission to Allah, reminding herself that her worth is not dependent on the opinions of people, but on the sight of her Creator. This act of obedience becomes a form of empowerment because it is rooted in choice. A choice to honor her faith over fashion, her principles over popularity, and her modesty over modernity. While the world celebrates self-expression through exposure, the woman of hijab expresses herself through restraint, strength, and grace. Her silence in the face of mockery is not weakness, it is spiritual maturity. Her confidence does not come from how much attention she receives, but from the peace that fills her heart when she knows she is living for something greater than the temporary applause of people. In a culture that glorifies rebellion against divine boundaries, she becomes a rebel of another kind, one who resists the chains of objectification by wrapping herself in the fabric of devotion. It is crucial to understand that the hijab is not just a matter of clothing, but a manifestation of a mindset, a reflection of humility, dignity, and spiritual awareness. It is a declaration that the woman wearing it has chosen to protect her soul from the diseases of vanity and comparison. The hijab is not meant to isolate her from the world, but to elevate her above its distractions. Through it, she learns to value herself not as a commodity for admiration, but as a soul with a purpose. It changes how she views her identity and her interactions. Her self-respect grows from knowing that she is no longer bound by the expectations of society, but by the will of her Lord. The strength it takes to wear hijab consistently, despite criticism or judgment, is not ordinary strength. It is the strength of conviction born from faith. This courage often goes unseen, but Allah sees every struggle, every moment she chooses to remain steadfast when others tell her to give up. Her patience becomes an act of worship. Her perseverance becomes a reflection of her love for Allah. The hijab thus becomes both her challenge and her protection, her trial and her triumph. It shields her from superficiality while inviting her to live more consciously and purposefully. It calls her to remember that her life is not about being seen, but about being known by the one who created her. And when she begins to understand this truth, something beautiful happens within her. She transforms. The hijab becomes not a weight she carries, but a crown she wears. It begins to shape her behavior, refine her thoughts, and guide her steps toward righteousness. She realizes that modesty is not only in clothing, but in speech, in conduct, and in the way she treats others. Her faith deepens because every time she looks in the mirror, she sees a reminder of Allah's command and her commitment to fulfill it. Her reflection becomes a symbol of resilience in a time when faith is often misunderstood. Even on the days when her heart feels heavy and the whispers of doubt surround her, she remembers that she is not alone, that every act done for Allah's sake, no matter how small, carries immense reward. The hijab connects her to a legacy of women who lived with purpose and strength. Women like Maryam Est, who found honor in modesty and strength in devotion. It links her to a timeless truth. That empowerment does not come from revealing the body, but from revealing the soul's loyalty to its creator. She learns that beauty is not in defiance, but in discipline, not in imitation, but in individuality rooted in faith. And through this realization, She begins to see the hijab not as a boundary, but as freedom, freedom from the cycle of needing to be seen, approved, and validated. In the stillness of her heart, she finds that this choice, often misunderstood by the world, has given her something priceless: peace. For when a woman chooses Allah over the world, she gains both strength and serenity, and in that moment she discovers that her hijab was never about restriction, but about recognition of her worth, her faith, and her divine purpose. The world often tells women that empowerment lies in unveiling, in breaking away from divine guidance to embrace the ideals of freedom crafted by human perception. Yet true liberation is not found in the removal of fabric, but in the uncovering of the soul's submission to its creator. The hijab is not the prison the world paints it to be. It is the quiet strength that whispers dignity in a world that shouts exposure. It teaches discipline in a time of indulgence, humility in an age of arrogance, and devotion in a generation drowning in distractions. The woman who wears the hijab is not chained. She is consciously free. Every morning when she places her hijab upon her head, she makes a spiritual statement to the universe that her body is not for public consumption, her beauty is not a tool for validation, and her worth is not measured by how appealing she appears to others. She rejects the false empowerment of being desired and embraces the true power of being devoted. Her decision is not born from weakness or coercion, but from faith and awareness that Allah's wisdom surpasses human trends. While others may view her as oppressed, she walks with the quiet confidence of knowing that her submission to Allah gives her a strength that cannot be taken away. She is not confined by her covering. She is elevated by it because the hijab is not about hiding the woman, but about revealing her values, her discipline, and her obedience to her Lord. This act of wearing the hijab, though seemingly simple, becomes an act of resistance in a society that glorifies the external and neglects the internal. It is not an easy path. It requires courage to stand apart in a crowd that constantly tells you to blend in. The woman in hijab faces mockery, misunderstanding, and sometimes isolation, but her perseverance in the face of these trials becomes a testimony to her faith. Every glance of judgment she endures becomes a mark of strength written in her book of deeds. Every time she is told to remove it for acceptance and refuses, she is, in that moment, accepted by the one whose approval truly matters. The hijab shapes her character, teaching her patience, resilience, and gratitude. It is a shield that protects her not only from the gaze of others, but from the ego within. It constantly reminds her that her purpose is not to be adored by creation, but to be loved by the Creator. Through her hijab, she learns to detach from superficial validation and to find satisfaction in sincerity. She walks with the dignity of a woman who knows who she is and whom she belongs to. And in a world that sells illusions of freedom, she embodies true independence, freedom from the need to please people, freedom from the fear of judgment, and freedom from the weight of comparison. She becomes a living reminder that obedience to Allah is not a loss of self, but the discovery of it. Over time, the hijab transforms her heart as much as it covers her head. It becomes a mirror reflecting her inner spiritual growth. She begins to realize that modesty is not only in appearance, but in attitude, in how she speaks, how she treats others, and how she guards her heart from arrogance and vanity. Her relationship with Allah deepens because her hijab constantly calls her back to her intention. It whispers to her in moments of weakness, reminding her why she began and for whom she continues. It teaches her that beauty is not in how she looks, but in how she lives. The hijab becomes a teacher, a companion, and a sign of her spiritual evolution. Even when she feels weary, even when doubts creep in, the remembrance of Allah strengthens her resolve. She learns that her hijab is not a burden, but a blessing, not a symbol of exclusion, but of belonging to the ummah of those who walk with purpose and faith. And when she faces the challenges of life, she carries herself with grace, knowing that Allah honors those who honor His commands. The world may not understand her journey, but Allah sees every step, every struggle, and every silent tear. The more she learns about her faith, the more she realizes that her hijab is part of a greater spiritual ecosystem, one that connects her heart to humility, her soul to submission, and her life to divine wisdom. It is through this understanding that she finds her voice, a voice that speaks not through noise, but through example, not through defiance, but through devotion. Ultimately, the hijab becomes more than fabric. It becomes a language of the soul, a silent dialogue between her and her Creator. Each fold, each choice to wear it with sincerity says, I belong to Allah. And in that belonging, she discovers peace that no worldly comfort could ever provide. The strength she once sought in people's validation, she now finds in her faith. She no longer needs to prove her worth. because she knows it has already been defined by the one who fashioned her. The hijab, which others see as restriction, becomes her wings, not to fly away from the world. To rise above it, it gives her perspective, teaching her that real empowerment is not about control over others, but control over the self. She realizes that wearing the hijab is not the end of her freedom, but the beginning of her authenticity. It anchors her when the world tries to pull her in every direction, reminding her that dignity is not for sale and faith is not a trend. She walks through life knowing that her worth is not negotiable and her purpose is divine. And so the hijab becomes her strength, her serenity, and her silent declaration that true beauty is not about being seen, but about being remembered, not for appearance, but for faith. And in that remembrance, she fulfills the essence of worship, to live not for the gaze of people, but for the gaze of the Almighty, the one who found her when she was lost, clothed her in dignity, and made her realize that the greatest honor a woman can wear is not on her head, but in her heart, the crown of faith.